Good morning. I know you are. Take your time. That was a run? Okay, if you say so. Morning, Betty. You ready to start? In a few minutes, okay. Well, I'll get started without you then. All right, we are, you can't read that, can you? Boop. As big as I can make it. Can you read that one? Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Philippians. We are in my favorite book of the entirety of Scripture because Paul wrote this for me. Did you know that? And Faye. All right, joy. Even while he's in prison, he's full of joy. And so we talked about chapter 2, verses 1 through 11-ish last week, right? Okay. So we had the idea of him breaking down the idea of what it means to live like Jesus, which is an important thing for all of us to do. Obviously, if we're following the Lord, then Paul is saying, then think like him, act like him, behave like him. And so the idea of him being God, but being born lowly like a servant, and then serving like a servant. If we are going to be following the Lord, then we also should live like servants, is the main thrust behind verses 1 through 11. And then verse 12, we have the word therefore in the English. You know what I'm required to say, don't you? You stop and see what it's there for, right? All these cliches, but they're cliches for a reason. The reason why I tell little unfunny jokes as we go through Scripture, hopefully that when you read it again, you might think, what was that stupid thing that Alan said that should be important here? What was that dumb joke that wasn't very funny at all? And if that can jog your memory at all, my job is complete. Because that's one of those things that you say, well, you know, he said something about this, and that meant, and then you read the context, and you hopefully can remember something of it. So every time you see the word therefore, you stop and see what it's there for. You're building on the previous context, right? That's the whole idea here. So verse 12, therefore, because we are full of the idea that Christ as a servant is our model, our example, therefore, my beloved, as you have always obeyed, so now, not only as in my presence, but much more in my absence, work out your own salvation with fear and trembling. Pause right there. Talk about a verse that we have taken and applied to a lot of different situations. Work out your own salvation with fear and trembling. There's a couple of thoughts around here that come to mind. I think the biggest one is the idea that he's making it a very personal journey for the audience, the recipients of the Philippian letter, those in Philippi, to understand that salvation is an individual thing, isn't it? It's collective in the sense that we are all in the church and that we're all brothers and sisters in Christ, and we all have a dynamic among one another, as Brian would say, right? But we also have this idea that at the end of the day, if we want to use that phraseology, whose responsibility is it to make sure that you are right with God? You, right? So again, we can assist each other and encourage and exhort and even correct each other when it comes to theological concepts. But at the end of the day, you are ultimately responsible for your own soul, right? Is that not true? I think it is. So, again, there is encouragement, there is instruction, there is exhortation and uplifting that takes place collectively. But at the end of the day, when it comes to your salvation, ultimately you are responsible for it. And so, for me, that is so important because sometimes you might hear the idea that my job is to be the defect detector, or the elder's job is to be the defect detector, to make sure that you are living in the right way. And while the elders and the preacher even maybe has some responsibility when it comes to teaching correct theology, ultimately, at the end of the day, you are responsible for your own actions, lifestyle choices, etc., when it comes to your relationship with God. So we can assist you, but I'm not the judge, thankfully, because my vision is very limited, and my ability to detect your heart is almost non-existent. And so at the end of the day, if I can just take care of my own soul, that's enough. If I can help you along the way of your own maturity and spiritual growth and your work in the kingdom, great. That's wonderful. But when it comes to the idea of me judging someone else and what their heart is, I have a hard time doing that because it's not my job. Thankfully, it's not. Okay? Is that clear? Jim, be careful now. Okay.
I'm hoping that you're going to go out onto how we work out our salvation.
No. You're welcome. Here's what you want, is you want to, don't you? 2 Timothy 2:15, what's that say, Faye? Well, talk about another verse we can apply to be diligent to show yourself approved unto God. A workman, a work person that may not be ashamed, right? Yeah, okay. Moving on, verse 13, because it is God who works in you both to will and to work for his good pleasure. Ultimately, who are we working alongside of in the kingdom of God? God. Right. So in Philippi, they weren't going through much persecution as of yet. And so the idea that they were working in the kingdom, they were spreading the gospel, they were growing together in unity, all serving one another the way that God designed the church to be, is what they're doing. And so Paul is trying to encourage them to keep going in that direction. And then they wouldn't be guilty of this. Verse 14, do all things without grumbling or disputing. Why? That you may be blameless and innocent, children of God without blemish in the midst of a crooked and twisted generation, among whom you shine as lights in the world. Pause right there. Okay. Let's see. First, verse 14 first. Do all things without grumbling or disputing. It's an interesting concept. How would you rephrase that if you were to rephrase it? Quit complaining. We wouldn't do that, would we? No. Let's go over to, let's see, 1 Corinthians chapter 10. It's a whole lot here in 1 Corinthians 10. Let's go to verse 1 just to kind of get a context here, because you kind of have to, right? For I do not want you to be unaware, brothers, that our fathers were all under the cloud and passed through the sea and were immersed or baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea. They all ate the same spiritual food. They all drank the same spiritual drink, for they drank from the spiritual rock that followed them, and that rock was Christ. This is Paul's, he's very much spiritualizing the wilderness journey from Egypt during the Exodus. He's taking the actual literal physical events that took place and he's spiritualizing them. He's seeing a figure in there. He's like, well, there was a cloud over them, and that cloud was God's presence. And they all passed through the Red Sea, so you had the water on the right, water on the left, water vapor over top, so they were immersed. They were baptized, which is a very Paul thing to do because he's spiritualizing the actual Exodus event. And they all ate the same spiritual food. What might imply the manna there. They all drank from the rock that was dry, and from that rock, that dead rock, if you will, living water or flowing water came forth, and that was kind of like Jesus. So he's kind of seeing the imagery of the Exodus to be like the imagery of Christianity. So they were all immersed in water, which begins their spiritual journey following Christ. They all ate the same food, drank the same water. That's kind of like how Christians are all fed from the Word of God. Okay, all right. Verse 5, nevertheless, with most of them God was not pleased, because they were overthrown in the wilderness. Now take these things as examples for us, that we might not desire evil as they did. And he'll go on to the rest of the chapter, really, and be like, well, if we look at the ancient Israelites during the Exodus as an example of how we follow the Lord, Adonai, we follow Jesus in our context, then they all began the same way, were fed the same things, but with most of them, they didn't make it to the promised land, right? Which is Paul spiritualizing the actual Exodus and conquest periods, right? So he's saying, if we look to that illustration, that example for us, we can all begin our walk with Christ in the same way. And because they were overthrown, God was not pleased to bring them to the promised land. Christians, be careful that you don't begin your Christian walk and don't make it to the promised land, which is what? Heaven. So that's Paul doing that. He's saying, here's an illustration from the Exodus that you all grew up hearing about in synagogue. Now I'm making that application to be your Christian walk. And if you go back into the Exodus story and you read about what were the issues that God had with the Israelites that were during the Exodus, number one was complaining, disputing, grumbling, complaining. And so when Paul says in Philippians chapter 2, verse 14, do all things without grumbling or disputing, he's saying, learn the lessons of the past. They were lacking perspective on what God had saved them from, and because of that, they were complaining about things that didn't really matter. Pardon me. Okay. That you may be blameless and innocent, children of God, without blemish, in the midst of a crooked and twisted generation, among whom you shine as lights in the world. Now, I will give you a little preview. The idea of shining in a world of darkness as lights is a consistent theological theme, especially in the New Testament. I mean, Christ himself in his Sermon on the Mount talked about the idea of us letting our light so shine into the world, right? Hide it under a bushel? No, I'm going to let it shine, right? It's a children's song, but the theology there is sound enough. And so that idea will come into play during our sermon as well. So just keep that in mind. Holding fast to the word of life, so that in the day of Christ I may be proud that I did not run in vain or labor in vain. What's that mean, verse 16? Oh, hold on. Mary, and then George. Go ahead.
Some people believed, and they listened to him, they believed what he said, and they applied it to their lives in order to please God.
Right.
Some of them did. And that's proof that he did not waste his time.
Okay. George?
I was going to say, it just means that on the day of judgment, they will be with him, and his work will not have been in vain. They will have made it to heaven.
Yeah. It's the reality of Christianity that not everyone that hears the message that you repeat that someone once told you, the gospel, that when they obey it, it's not a guarantee that they're going to make it to the finish line to be to heaven. I mean, that's not encouraging, but it's a reality that Paul was facing here. He's saying, I know that not everybody that I've preached and that has obeyed the gospel is going to make it. So I want you to work out your own salvation, quit complaining, quit disputing, get to work, that you may make it to the end and fulfill my joy, that the work that I've invested into you by instructing you, teaching you, and so on, is not empty. It's not vanity. It's not gone. Sorry again? Yeah. George?
Over in my study Bible here is once saved, always saved. So when he comes to a passage like that, he always points out that those people were never truly saved. How he can make that judgment, I don't know, but he does.
He said he was proud, and there's nothing wrong with that. Sometimes we think that, oh, you shouldn't be. Well, when you do something good, you can be proud without going around blasting and telling it to everyone.
The way I think about that idea of having pride in them making it to the end successfully, the way God intended, I mean, it's not that much different than having a child that you're proud of, because, I mean, you know, I got kids. Have you met them? Have you heard one of them? Yeah, so the idea is when you have a child that you're instructing how to be polite and they use manners, and whenever, for example, one of my kids walk over and says, "Yes, ma'am," I'm like, got him. Yes, I did something good to try to teach them to be respectful to someone else. When they do good things, you're proud of them because you've helped teach them, instruct them. It's their choice, it's their option. They can do right or wrong, but you've laid down that material. In a similar way, Paul is saying here, the things that I've taught you and invested in you when it comes to time and energy and so on, I'm investing in you being successful, and I'm proud that I was a part of that journey. It's one way to think about that. I'm not going to touch on the once saved, always saved thing because I don't have enough time in the world to chase that rabbit. Some of my favorite preachers of the New Testament are people that subscribe to Calvinistic teachings. But their preaching is spectacular. And to see the mental gymnastics one has to do to kind of twist what they're saying to fit their theology just blows my mind every time. I respect them so much for their scholarship and their preaching ability and their phraseology. I just love it. And then when they get to a text like this, where this once saved, always saved kicks in, to just see them flip a switch and just go off, I'm like, where in the world did that come from? But, okay, enough of that. Okay, verse 17. He's wanting to be proud of them, that they are going to make it to the end, if you will, even if I am to be poured out as a drink offering upon the sacrificial offering of your faith. I am glad and rejoice with you all. Now, don't miss the word picture here. What's he saying in verse 17? Even if he has to die and shed his own blood for them to make it to the end, he's happy to do so. That's a pretty big statement. I mean, the imagery here, so you have a bunch of different Jewish things taking place here in the imagery. A drink offering was a type of offering that one could do under the Old Testament law, especially during the Second Temple period. So what did a drink offering look like? What kind of drink was it? It was wine. Okay, all right. So what color usually is wine? Kind of red, right? Sometimes you have white, but in this part of the world especially, it was red. And so when you have a drink offering, what do you think you do with it? You pour it somewhere. There's an altar. Okay, so an altar is a big fire pit, if you will. It has kind of corners on the end to keep everything on the inside. Usually you think of an altar for the Jewish temple to be a giant fire pit, which is what it was. And normally you think about animals being killed and then being burnt on the altar, right? Everybody with me? So if you have a drink offering, guess what you do? You've got a cup, or you have a jar, a container, a vessel that holds the wine, usually the first fruits of the harvest that year, and you would pour it out on the altar. So where you would have the animal sacrificed, you'd pour out the wine. Not all of it, but you pour out the first portion of the harvest for that year to appreciate what God gave you during that harvest, right? All the rain, all the work, all the land, etc. You're appreciative of that. So what Paul is saying here is, you know how you go to the altar in Jerusalem and they pour out that red liquid all over the altar to be a sacrifice for the Lord? As the harvest was plentiful that year, I'm willing to shed my own blood to make sure that you make it to heaven. And I'll be happy to do so. So when he uses the imagery here of being poured out as a drink offering, think of it in that very literal way. He's going, as we see the wine flowing from the altar as a sacrifice, my own blood is that sacrifice, and I'm willing and happy to do so. I will rejoice if I'm given an opportunity to die for you to make it. So when you read 2 Timothy, for example, and he's writing to his young preacher follower, companion, Timothy, and he goes, I'm already being poured out as a drink offering. What does that imply to you? He's starting to bleed for this in a literal way. He's about to die. So he says, make sure you come to me before winter hits. Bring the books, bring the parchments, bring the scrolls. And, by the way, bring this guy Mark with you as well. Got some things to talk to him about. So, well, it depends on kind of where you are. Where he is not in prison per se. It's what we would consider house arrest. So he's paying rent for a place that he's literally chained inside of. He can't go out, but people can come to him. So right, like with him, at the beginning of Philippians chapter 1, verse 1, is Paul and who else? Timothy's right there. And Epaphroditus is right there, probably like carrying this letter back to the Philippian church. So he's got people with him. If you look at the very end of Acts, it's interesting because you have a lot of Jewish people, a lot of Jewish leaders in Rome came to hear why Paul's in prison because they know this Pharisee's in chains and they want to figure out why. So they all come to Paul under house arrest to hear the gospel. And some obeyed and some didn't. Again, it's one of those ironic things. They tried to stop Paul from preaching the gospel. So they tried to arrest him and throw him in prison. He appealed to Caesar. They had to ship him over to Rome. And there he awaits trial by Caesar, which eventually he will be killed by Caesar. But before that takes place, he's now a located preacher, and people are coming to him to hear the gospel. You can't really stop him. Even when he dies, he's okay with that because he said before in chapter 2, I'm ready to go and be with the Lord. That's the best thing for me. But it's more needful that I stay here and encourage you and write the book of Philippians for us. So, okay, don't miss the imagery here in verse 17. Sometimes you just read that, you're like, okay, yeah. But if you get what Paul is thinking about here from a Jewish perspective, as they pour out the red wine over the altar, he's thinking about his own blood being poured out, and he's happy to do so. That's dedication to the gospel beyond what I can even comprehend. Likewise, verse 18, you should also be glad and rejoice with me. I mean, yeah, I know what he means. Are they going to be happy when Paul's executed? I mean, no, not in that sense, but also if he dies, where does he go? He goes to paradise. So at the end of the day, it's one of those things where this Christian perspective, you can't stop it if you're living a life of faith. You can't. Like, the only thing that's going to make you stop and make you fail before the judge of heaven and earth is you. At the end of the day, you are the only thing keeping you from heaven because the Lord's with you. People are with you. If they kill you, you go to heaven. What are you going to do? I mean, the easiest funeral that I've ever preached has been for a good Christian man and a good Christian woman who have lived a full life, and they've seen their great-grandchildren, and they went peacefully in their sleep. And you go, well, we know where they went. I mean, unless there's something drastic we don't know about. There's bodies in the basement or whatever, but for everything we know, they are the example of living a full, good Christian life. And there's not much to be sad about beyond the fact that they're no longer physically with us, but we'll see them again. Lord willing, and the creek don't rise, as Grandma used to say. We didn't have any creeks near our house. I don't know what you're talking about, but okay.
Right by verse
Did I? I mean, no, not really. What do you want to bring out of verse 13?
I think context, as far as
My favorite word. Go ahead.
growing up, I got this daily dose of you've got to be good. You've got to strive. And there's part of that. But we don't spend a lot of time talking about you're not alone. And there's comfort and consolation in that part of it that I don't think I heard a lot of growing up.
Whenever I think about that phrase, you're not alone, unfortunately, the thing that comes to mind is what I was instructed, that God's always watching you.
Yes. But not in this context.
No, not at all. In fact, the idea that God's watching you, to me, is like, be careful. Big brother's watching. You know. Your Father in heaven's watching. Just one second. Let me finish this thought. I'll move on. Yes. We're, even in our deepest, darkest loneliness, we are never alone. I mean, I've preached sermons before where my entire point I wanted you to walk away from the sermon with was, God has promised consistently, no matter the covenant he's made with his people, he will be with you. He'll be with you. He'll be with you. If you just look for, I will be with you in the Bible, it's just full of it. Because God knows that we as people need to know that we're not doing it by ourselves. My favorite one is Elijah. Because this poor dude, he's on Mount Carmel, and they're trying to sacrifice to Baal a sacrifice, and Baal's not showing up. Surprise, surprise. And then Elijah just says a prayer real quick, douses his offering with water, and fire from heaven comes and devours it, and he's won the day. And then what immediately happens right afterwards? You hear from the wife of the king, I'm going to hunt you down and kill you. So what does Elijah do? Bring it on. I've got fire from heaven protect. No, he runs off terrified, and he says to God, kill me. I'm all alone. I'm the only one. And we had that entire 1 Kings 19 section where God is trying to get this guy to see reality. He's not been alone at any moment of his ministry, even during the reign of Ahaz, or Ahab, rather. So, yes, God is working in them, both to will for what they want to do and to work for his good pleasure. I mean, I'll be with you always, even until the end of the world or age or generation. Right? That's the end of that passage. Okay, Mary.
I was just going to say the words have meaning. God is watching us. He is watching over us. And when you got that word over, changes the meaning. But Jesus taught us to pray, Our Father in heaven. My understanding of God's love for me at 16, I understood enough to be baptized and commit my life to trying to obey the gospel, the whole gospel. But when I became a mother, God's love turned into something else for me. I had a better understanding of it. So God is watching us all the time. He's watching over us. And when we get to this verse 13, where it is God who works in you, both to will and to work for his good pleasure. Well, it's not his good pleasure that I do the things Elijah did or Peter and Paul did. He wants me to do what he wants me to do. And, you know, my talent might be spelling better than Ralph. We've been married 15 years. But that doesn't make me a better person than Ralph.
I don't know. I met Ralph.
I know, and he's back here in the control room right now listening to everything we say. He's watching over us.
He's watching you.
Yeah. So anyway, but it's God who's working in us to use the talents we have and to grow more talents. And yes, God does watch us, but he watches over us and
I agree. Anything else you want to bring out? That's good? Okay. All right, well, here we go. Verse 19. We're getting away from theology and getting more like personal remarks here in this next context, which is helpful to understand the overall scope of, again, what this book is. While it's a book about joy, again, remember the introduction we talked about a couple weeks ago. What is Philippians? It's a thank you note. It's like, hey, I had a second to say thank you for the gifts that you sent. Here's how we kind of learn that from the context. Verse 19, I hope in the Lord Jesus to send Timothy to you soon, that I too may be cheered by news of you. There's no Facebook updates back in the first century, right? So he doesn't really know how they're doing. And you'll kind of get you kind of got the feeling of that in Ephesians. You'll kind of get the feeling of this in Philippians. When you get to other books like 2 Corinthians is like the one. He was terrified for how the church is doing, and he didn't know because he wasn't there. So he writes them a letter saying, I really want to know, are you guys still there? Like, are you still following Jesus? Has the church been destroyed by the local population? Because everywhere I went, they tried to kill me. I mean, they ran me off too. So, like, how are you guys doing there amongst all of that? This is what this is. I want to hear how well you're doing. If you're doing well, if you're starting to doubt, if you're walking away from Christianity, going back to Judaism or paganism, like how's it going there in that area? Because, verse 20, I have no one like him who will be genuinely concerned for your welfare. Because Paul was genuinely concerned for how they were doing, and Timothy had that same feeling, that same sentiment. Because they all seek their own interest, not those of Jesus. Who's the they in verse 21? Is that right? It's almost like I knew. For they all seek their own interests, not those of Jesus Christ. You're
that were
preaching Christ out of contention and pride and arrogance. The ones that are out there showing a good show, but on the inside their hearts are not right. They all seek their own interests, not those of Jesus. So he's saying Paul and Timothy are of a certain kind of breed where they actually really care about how they're doing spiritually. What is this book again? A thank you note for all the money that was sent from Philippi to Rome through Epaphroditus to Paul and Timothy. So what might they be more interested in than their own spiritual welfare? There's a whole lot of money coming through from Philippi. I want to see how they're doing too. One thought. Okay. Let's see, verse 22. But you know Timothy's proven worth, how as a son with a father he has served with me in the gospel. I mean, talk about just setting it up perfectly. I mean, I think God knows what he's doing, but he did something special when he chose Paul, and he gave us a completely, full, fallible human being that's a really good role model to follow, because he did way worse stuff than any of us, if you want to compare it that way, to the church, but he was still redeemed and forgiven and then got to work in the kingdom. And one of the things that he did through Paul was establish this relationship that an older man or a woman can have with a younger man or a woman when it comes to being a mentor. Because Paul was the leader, and Timothy picked up right after him. I mean, he just followed him everywhere he went, which is great to see how that dynamic can work of being a mentor in the faith. And then verse 23, I hope therefore to send him just as soon as I see how it will go with me. I mean, there's a whole lot said without being said here. What's he really mean from the context? Yeah, if I'm going to get executed, I kind of want Timothy here to not be alone during this. I'd love to have him with me. But as soon as I figure out whether or not my head's on the chopping block the next week or two, I'm going to send him to you to make sure that you guys are okay. And I want to hear back from him if I'm still here. Verse 24. And I trust in the Lord that shortly I myself will also come. If we date the prison epistles to him being in Rome at the end of Acts, that's one thing that we can say is a possibility. Then he never made it to Philippi. He never left Rome. He just stayed there. I mean, there's no evidence biblically or extra-biblically that he ever got released from that imprisonment in the book of Acts. There's a theory that he got released, he went on to Spain, and then he came back, but that's shaky at best. When it comes to this imprisonment being not in Rome, but being in Ephesus at an earlier date, then maybe he made it there afterwards. But personally, I lean more towards the Roman imprisonment than the Ephesian imprisonment. So that's something to keep in mind. Okay, and then verse 25. I have thought it necessary to send to you Epaphroditus, my brother and fellow worker and fellow soldier, and your messenger and minister to my need. So again, to kind of track this back through the context, Epaphroditus was a member of the church at Philippi. They had some money to drop off to Paul in Rome, because they wanted to support him emotionally, spiritually, financially. So they sent Epaphroditus to Rome. Epaphroditus made it, gave him the gift, and then here's Epaphroditus, here's Timothy, Roman guard A, Roman guard B, and Paul over a desk, which is not how it happened, but it's how it happens in my brain. And he's writing out, which he didn't write out, but you get the idea. He's saying, I'm sending Epaphroditus, your member, back to you, who gave me the things that you sent. That's how it's all kind of tracking so far. Because he has been longing for you all and has been distressed because you heard he was ill. So, the Philippian church knows, through a messenger probably, Epaphroditus made it to Rome, gave Paul the gift, but he's sick. So they're concerned. Is he going to come back? Is he all right? Did he pull through? What's going on? This is the letter saying he's fine. Indeed, he was ill, verse 27, near to death, but God had mercy on him, and not only on him, but on me also, lest I should have sorrow upon sorrow. So I'm glad that Epaphroditus, he was ill, really close to death, but God spared him that I wouldn't be sad, that I can't hear from you, and might be executed. And also Epaphroditus, who was sent on this mission to give me those financial resources, he died on the way too. That's going to be a bummer, but I'm able to rejoice. Okay? So I am more eager to send him, therefore, that you may rejoice at seeing him again, that I may be less anxious. Be anxious for nothing, but in everything by prayer and supplication. Interesting. Okay. So receive him in the Lord with all joy and honor such men, because he nearly died for the work of Christ, risking his life to complete what was lacking in your service to me. So again, that's how we kind of pick up the threads that, okay, so what this letter really is him saying, he brought me your gift. Thank you for that. He almost died on the way, but he's okay. He's coming back to you, so receive him, which implies to us that Epaphroditus going from Rome to Philippi, he says, hey, I made it back. Paul's okay for now. By the way, he wrote you a little letter. And we're reading that letter right now. Okay. Keeping in mind how this may have looked in the first century, or how it did look really, is the majority of people, especially in the first century church, were illiterate. They couldn't read, they could not write, especially Koine Greek. If they were Jewish, they might know a little bit of Hebrew from synagogue, but they wouldn't have been able to be fully literate in Koine Greek. So how did people hear about what the book of Philippians, the letter to the Philippian church, said? They would come together as the church and say, hey, by the way, we got a letter from Paul. Remember Paul? Taught us the gospel, right? Okay. Well, he says this, and they would read the letter. And week after week after week after week, they would read that letter, And every time they heard it, they would learn something new. And they say, you know what? There's a whole lot of good stuff in here about Christianity. Can we make a copy of that and send it somewhere else? To other churches that are struggling with things that we're struggling with? That's how those copies of copies of copies of copies were made and then spread around. And then before you know it, talking 80 years later, every church has a set of these volumes, of these books written by apostles that they would use for instruction on what Christianity is all about. And then after 150 years or so, everyone knew what the main ones were, if you will, which everybody had. And then they got together and they compiled them and said, you know what, it might be a good idea to just kind of keep copies of these books together. And then we have a New Testament. Right? So that's kind of a macro view of what we're looking at here. We'll pick up here in chapter 3, verse 1, Lord willing, next week. Thank you for your time and your attention this morning. We'll be dismissed now for about 16 minutes before worship begins.